order the August 12, 2014 workshop of the Oshkosh Common Council. This is the second budget workshop we've had. The budget process takes us about 4 months. We'll probably be coming up with a final budget sometime in early November and talking about it in November and putting it out there for people to comment in late October, early November. But to get some background information for the council and also to have some information out there for people that may be watching us to get some background information, we're holding these workshops. I think altogether we're probably going to have 4 kind of unofficial workshops, and then we have 2 regular workshops with the staff, and then the actual budget meetings. We have 4 council members here today. Trina's here, and Mark's here. To provide some leadership for us, we should have either 2 or 3 more council members coming in as we get through the workshop. They have other commitments at this point in time. So I'm going to turn it over to the city manager, Mr. Roloff, to take the lead first.
Okay. You saw the agenda that we have for tonight. There's 6 general areas. We're going to go through the 6-month financials, go into financial model assumptions we made, as well as financial projections for the next 5 years, to give you an idea of what we're projecting. And this is really projecting, not saying these are what departments have submitted. This is projecting what we think the levy is going to look like, or what the shortfall would look like, depending on whatever levy would be ultimately decided on by the council. Talk about some of the components of the debt, and then a little bit from direction on budget policy. Since we are in the midst of this, departments are preparing their final budget requests, and we're going to start reviewing them in the next couple weeks, and then set time for future workshops and just check everybody's schedule. So that's kind of the general agenda for today. With that, I'd ask you to pull out the second quarter budget reports. There's a section for both revenues as well as expenditures to give you an idea of where we're going. The revenue page, I believe, is the first handout you have. Is that correct? Okay.
Yes.
Revenues are generally tracking okay. The only real concern, maybe 2 concerns that we've seen, and we're double checking. You recall that we've made a statement about our accounting system and some gremlins in our dated accounting system. Some of our revenues on licenses and permits seem to be down, but based on the activity from Mr. Davis, there seems to be a little concern there. So we're checking that out. The revenues look low. We're checking to make sure that if that's okay or not. That is one revenue that right now looks to be down, and it really shouldn't be given the activity we've seen. Things that you may be concerned about that I would assure you not to be concerned about. For example, under state and county aids, you see that we're only at 16%. That's very typical for this time of year. We get a very short installment in shared revenues in July, which we did receive. The bulk of that revenue, which is $9.6 million, isn't received until November, the 3rd week of November. So that's very typical for state shared revenue, as well as the expenditure restraint, which is a huge portion of that. The state aid to local streets, we get on a quarterly basis, so we're pretty much dead on with what we had there. So those are the ones that are normally of concern, but they're not to be concerned about. The other revenue that I would say is probably an issue to be concerned about is interest earnings. The interest earnings are still very low. Interest on investments, you'll see that we're only about 27%. We do some reconciling at the end of the year, which jumps it up a little bit, but we're still suffering from low returns on interest on investments. Other than that, are there any other revenues that I missed on that seem to be not tracking?
Garbage fee.
Oh, that's right. Why don't you go ahead and you deal with that one since.
Okay. So what has happened is this garbage fee that has been budgeted in the 100 general fund was also budgeted when we created the new fund during the budget process this year. So at this point, it is a duplicate revenue. So we will not be realizing the $115,000 in revenues.
So that's a revenue that we effectively double budgeted. So we're going to be short on that because that should have been moved over to the refuse fund when we when we created the refuse fund to deal with expenditure restraint, we didn't move that revenue over, and we should have. So it's not that the revenue shortfall, it's just going to another fund. But we're going to have to make that up next year. It's going to be a shortfall this year, and we're going to have to make it up next year. So we are getting the revenue, but it's just showing up in the refuse fund instead.
And this is coming from where? When we talk about the garbage fees?
The garbage fees, yep, on the second page, so it'd be under charges for current services.
Right. Essentially, what are the fees?
Those are typically fees for when we have to do extra pickups or violation pickups for, say, people leaving stuff out at the curb at, say, end of year school, stuff like that. We go out and clean it up. Is that a fair statement, Dave?
And we also have special collections where people pay at the counter on the first floor.
Okay.
This is not the $20.
Yeah, where's that $20?
That is in
show
the
up?
recycling fund.
That's in the recycling.
Recycling fund. We're only really going over the general fund right now, so
Okay.
that's not showing up here.
The only other thing I would point out to the council, in council workshop 1, payment in lieu of taxes was a question. Those revenues are primarily received at the end of the year, so you will notice that currently we've received 16.33%, but they are predominantly received at the end of the year, and the council was inquiring on that last year.
And is that
I mean,
money we get from the county then?
It is
Two big ones you said were,
Housing Authority, we get a pilot from Goodwill, and multiple housing authorities.
those are the primary ones we get from.
Okay.
Okay, on the expenditure.
One other question in that area. We talked about, I think last time, we're paid by churches and schools and so forth for fire protection. Is that more of a gentleman's agreement?
Most of those are, if they're done voluntarily, and they would show up here if they made a payment in lieu of taxes. And generally, if we do get those, they're very minor. The big ones are the ones that Ms. Larson mentioned.
What about the university system of the state?
That's under payment for municipal services. That is one of the state and county aids. It's just simply termed municipal services. We get that pretty early on in the year, and you can see that that's one revenue that we've actually received the full amount, or, we've got that for the year. That's the one that's been getting cut down, and we're getting about 45 cents on the dollar now. So they're reliable payers, whatever they decide they want to pay.
But the payment in lieu of taxes, that there's no set formula. It's just sort of.
It's entirely voluntary.
Is that how it's handled by most communities in the state?
Yeah, some have a pilot ordinance, but in reality, they don't necessarily have the authority, and they usually negotiate those things. Pilot being the term for payment on taxes.
We also show marked mobile home taxes. Are they taxed differently than residential properties? Is that why that shows up separately?
Yeah, are you familiar with that one? In short, yeah, there's a
The
separate.
valuation of their property versus, because they don't really have a lot?
They're
Property.
considered cars, they're considered vehicles like, a trailer, but they're just parked, so they pay differently, and it comes back to us in a different way.
Because we have, 3 mobile home parks in the city? I think we have one out on Sunnyview, we have one on
20th,
out by the old truck stop, that one Fountain Avenue, and then the one on 20th.
20th, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. On the expenditure side, there are no real surprises because, we knew the big issues last year where we weren't familiar with what some of the settlements were going to be. We're in the third year of a contract. We're very much familiar with what things are going to be. So there are no real surprises on anything that we're aware of. So things are going along well, both in the general fund as well as the levy funds. So you can see that we're on track for those. Excuse me. Any questions on the expenditure side?
Going back to the unclassified total unclassified. Second page there.
Yes.
Those tend to be going down. We budgeted considerably less this year.
The main
Although
number,
we've collected more at this point in time than we did last year, but
these are expenditures under unclassified. Those are expenditures, and the primary reduction was the adjustment of salaries. When we moved things around, that 200,000 was then reduced to 73,000. So that's the main reason for the drop. The unclassified expenses, that specific line item, most of that is actually outside legal services, and that has always been a challenge. If you know, we've had that discussion in past years that our legal fees are up, and we've always been trying to get a handle on that. This year, in addition to very little on the labor side, because we haven't been getting into that yet. A lot of that is things like buck staff. That's buck staff and Pioneer. If we use outside counsel. Buck staff, we use outside counsel. I shouldn't say Pioneer, because Pioneer, we've pretty much done everything internally with the council, or with our in-house counsel.
I see that mobile home tax shows back up again under the unclassified, but that talks about mostly employee stuff. Why is it in that category again?
So those are actually what our parking fees.
That we pay. I'm not familiar enough with that, Steve. I'm going to
Okay.
have to get back to you on
Yeah,
that.
because it just seems where it's weird, because it talks about, unemployment and employee benefits, and then all of a sudden it shows up again in the mobile home tax.
Yeah, it's called parking fees, so I'm not really sure. I don't know the details of that one.
Okay.
You could look at that,
Yeah.
Trina. We'll get back to you on that.
Just curiosity more than anything.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. Because I don't know if that would be a duplication.
No, because one's on the revenue, one's on the expenditure. I'm sure they're an
Okay.
offset to something, but I don't know the answer for you.
Okay. And that is something then we budget for too, then?
Yeah, and it's based on history.
Okay.
We've been consistently putting a number in there, but I would imagine that's something from the state.
All right.
Okay. Were we going to talk about fund balance, this fund balance sheet here, or are we going to wait for that, Trina? This page. So that could be later?
Nope, we should talk about it right now.
Okay. Why don't you, in terms of where our fund. Sorry, here, you just borrow mine.
So you'll see that we have now completed the entries for our 2013 annual audit. You will see that we have had a decrease from our 2012 fund balance to our 2013 available fund balance, decrease in about $600,000.
Most of that was from the public safety contracts that we didn't budget for at the time. We'd reported that to council and reported that to Moody's when we did that. We don't anticipate that. Right now, we're on track to be balanced on the budget when expenditures and revenues all fall into place at the end of the year.
we want to explain the allowance each year for the amount due from the golf course fund. Uncollectible. Want to go
Go
through
ahead,
that?
because I,
This is something that has been reoccurring. It occurred when the golf course was closed for the 1 year for improvements to be made. And so this receivable has been booked and has not yet been returned back to the general fund. So it's carried forward. It actually, prior to 2009, it did come on this sheet.
Are we set to collect that at any certain point in time?
When the golf course is in a financial position to do so, it's sort of an IOU. I remind Mr. Dobish of it periodically because he talks about, well, we have all our debt paid off. Like,
Well, don't they, but they pay some down every year, don't they, at the end of the year, if they have any proceeds? At the end of the year, I mean, they pretty much break even, but
Doesn't look like it.
Yeah, it's been the same on here since 2009.
Yeah, there's very little that's paid.
where do we show what the grand owes the city? Is that in here too?
Grand owes the city
Or-
for
Did they have a 10-year, was it?
that. That was a pledge that was made as opposed to any kind of debt obligation on behalf of the grant. So that's not shown anywhere. When they do make that payment, that goes to the general fund, which we forward to the debt service fund to retire the debt on the grant that is in the debt service fund.
What is left on that debt? Because I had asked
The pledge, roughly 40,000 has been paid, give or take. I think it was about $10,000 this year, but it's been anywhere from 10 to 12,000 each year, so it's roughly 40, low 40s. That's been paid, yeah. They started the first payment in July of 2011, and they made their recent payment to us in early July. The balance would be roughly 210,000, probably a little under that. But again, it's a pledge as opposed to a debt obligation. Finance wouldn't even have that on the books. We know how much we've collected, and since it's a pledge as opposed to any kind of firm debt, it doesn't show up on the books as a receivable or anything like that. It's no different than the MD telethon. When somebody makes a pledge, all they're doing is saying, I'm willing to pay that off. It may show up on the books as a pledge, but if you never receive it, you don't have any recourse off of a pledge.
So when is the 10 years left then?
2020. Okay. We'd like to get into, talk about some of our financial models, and Trina did hand out in your packet on Friday some assumptions. You want to go through them, or you want me to?
Yep, I can give a broad overview of what we used. And so we used a model that has been used in the past, but we had changed and updated it. What we did is we looked at data from 2018 to 2013. And so we compiled...
2008, you mean?
Oh, excuse me. Yes, 2008 to 2013. And so we compiled the 6 years of actual data to get a 5-year average. And that would have been the third sheet that was attached on your revenue model. What we then did is we weighted that percent and brought that forward into the revenue calculations and used the higher amount of the percent in the new year. So in fact, we weighted 2013 data more than what we weighted 2008 data to adjust for the changes and the influxes for the revenues. And so we brought a 5-year weighted average and brought those forward. On the first page, you'll have the assumptions. And so you can see for under general property tax, if you looked at the 5-year weighted average, it was 2.38. So what this model showed is then in 2014, we put 2.38. We then weighted in 15, we were going to go to 1.19, down to 0.79, down to 0.59. So to try to adjust accurately and predict as close as we can. So we did this for all assumptions. There were some cases where we were unable to use an assumption just because a year had been skewed. There had been a large increase or a large decrease. And it skewed the weighted average. So in that case, we didn't use it. So the second page that you have then is the 5-year model and assumptions.
Just a second, just so people can come to understand it. Go back to your assumption, your general property tax. The 2.38 says what
So that was the weighted average
of the,
of the general property taxes. So in 14, we have the 2.38. So we then in 2015 went down to the 1.19%, and then in 2016 went down to 0.79%. So tried to weight the average.
okay, but just again, just so everybody understands, what does 2.38 mean and what does 1.19 mean? So as we're going through,
So
the 2.38.
that was the 5-year weighted average, 2.38.
It's a statistical number that we've plugged into the model just to say, we're projecting. You can agree with that type of assumption because it's really a discussion of methodology. But the methodology we used was based on what we pumped out of the accounting system, and then we put it into this model saying, looking forward based on these assumptions, we're making some pretty modest assumptions. We tried to,
Are these increases or decreases?
well, it depends. If you take a look at the assumptions, for example, take the first two. General property tax, we said for 2015, we're just making an assumption of 1.19% based on historical average. For aid to local streets, we're making a 0% assumption. And then the next one after that, municipal services, we already had that discussion. Statistically, we're getting an average of 2.09% decrease in payment for municipal services from the state. So we just plugged all those percentages in and then applied those percentages by category into this model to estimate our revenues for 2015. And then we also did it for 16 through 19. But just said, look, just want to give you an idea. Are these rock solid absolute numbers? No, not any way, shape, or form. But we're just trying to say, at this point in the year when we're trying to project revenues, it's a good model to use.
I'm just saying, the 2.38, you're assuming that's going to be the increase?
The 2.38 was based on the previous 5-year, or the previous 6 years.
What does that number say?
That means the average.
I know it's a 5-year weighted average, but what does that number say to the reader?
The reader, that the average increase in the property taxes for the 5 previous years to 2014 was 2.38%.
How do we factor into this property tax the assumption that property values are declining?
This is only on levy, and we've got another sheet that we're going to hand out to you to address that issue as well, because that's another issue. We're just talking about the dollars as opposed to the tax rate at this point. We're only talking about the levy. The council may say the 1.19 projection we're making is too high or too low. That really is a policy decision for the council. We're just throwing out statistics to show you what we plugged into our model. It's not an issue of saying, we recommend that you do this or we recommend you don't do that. We're just saying, statistically, we plugged it in because based on our track record, that's kind of what we've been doing. So just for modeling purposes, we plugged it in. It's not for approval or disapproval. It's just for information. And then as we get through this model, we're going to go do projections on revenues. We did a similar projection on expenditures. And then based on those projections, at this point in time, recognizing that the departments haven't even submitted their final budget yet, we're just doing a little projection to give you an idea of when we present you the budget in October, we're in this ballpark.
Again, I'm going to ask the question. Let's go to 2015, 1.19%. What does that say?
That's saying for our,
Property taxes are going to go up?
in our
You're assuming-
model, based on historical averages, 1.19% is going to be plugged into this model for purposes of illustration, for illustration purposes only. Because you'll see later on with another sheet that Trina prepared based on this, we're going to show you a series of levy scenarios, and then you can see what the impact will be with that. Impact on levy, impact on tax rate, with the assumptions for assessed value, as well as the impact on potential shortfall based on these numbers. Because if you go through them, I mean, you see a number of these revenues, for example, state and county aids, planning to go down, 0% change in expenditure restraint and state shared revenues. When you plug all those things in, there's going to be ups, there's going to be downs. In those cases, we're saying 0. It won't be 0. It'll be a little higher, a little lower. We don't know yet. We'll find out from the state in late September what that number ultimately is. These are statistical guesses at this point, what they are. It's really for illustration purposes to set you up for what the budget could potentially look like based on statistical analysis.
One more question on the property values. The property value, is that based on the assessor's evaluation of the property, or is it based on the most recent sale of the property? What's the form that we come up with for assessing the value of the property in the city?
We have some preliminary assessment numbers from the state that we're plugging in. That's probably one of the numbers that are really more certain at this point. That number we have a pretty good feel on, with the possible exception of industrial.
Yeah.
The industrial numbers are still coming from the state, but we're making some projections on that as well. But the assessed value numbers are probably some of the most reliable numbers you're going to see tonight.
The numbers are generated by the state versus?
No, they, based on numbers that we've submitted and based on their evaluation of our equalized value, which is our full market value, we have a pretty good feel for what our assessed value is going to be. Better than any number. That's probably the most reliable number we're going to give you tonight.
Does that also include like where we've had some of the commercial properties contesting what their assessed value is?
Yeah.
Is that incorporated in?
That's incorporated in there, yeah. So these are just the projections we used, and there's you certainly welcome to disagree with the methodology, but this is the methodology we employed to go forward. We did that on the revenue side, and you can see these are the major assumptions. Similarly, we also did an expenditure assumption. We did this a little differently because we're so heavy on personnel that we put most of our efforts into personnel. So you can see on the payroll side, it's this sheet here that says expense model and assumptions. The assumptions are on the far right side. And you'll recall that at the last meeting, payroll, we said based on wage increases of 2% and anticipated impact of step increases, overall and other contractual obligations, we estimate that would be about, payroll would be about 2.37%. And then we just did 1.5% out future years. But you can see the different numbers that we have. Contractual services, 1%. Utilities, 4%. Fixed charges, we're making assumption no increase. Materials and supplies, 1%. Then you can see the impact of WRS. Insurance, we mentioned the 12% at the last meeting. Social Security, 3%. So we went through those and plugged those assumptions into the numbers on the left for 2015.
Mark? Under payroll direct labor, we have other benefits, $30,000 for 2014 budget. What is that, and why is it not incorporated into the coming years?
Oh, I'll have, okay. You know the answer to that, Trina?
what it was is, it's not a normal payroll cost. So I did not assume that this abnormal payroll cost was going to continue. So it's not part of retirement, health insurance, Social Security. I didn't bring my detail with me, but I could get back to you, Caroline.
Yes, please. Thank you.
I want to go back again to the cells on the assumption. So you're saying you're assuming payroll is going to go up 2.37%? Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
And then each of the next years, it's only going to go up 1.5% each year?
We just plugged it in for purposes of illustration, not that it really is an illustration. That could vary based on what contractual arrangements happen, what the council does or doesn't do, and you can certainly, with a modest increase, when you see the final tally, you'll see that even with those modest increases, we're going to have a deficit situation. But we didn't want to do, you want to be careful when you're doing 5-year projections that you don't create this doom and gloom prophecy that that can often get fixed through what happens with anything, with revenues and anything else that can come up to play. We focused more on what we feel are our best estimates for 2015, and then 16 through 19, we said, let's be modest in those assumptions.
What are fixed charges?
Generally, insurance, and what are some of the other fixed charges?
Insurance as in health insurance?
Liability insurance,
Insurance on buildings, equipment?
yeah, stuff like that.
Mark, on that, going back to general fund under there, 2014, you have 15,400,000, then it jumps drastically the next 5 years, towards the top of the page. It goes from 15,400 to 56,500.
Yep, that's income and continuation insurance.
Right.
Our policy, we've actually had a premium, thank you, that's the term, premium holiday. The track record for that income continuation insurance has been so good, we've actually had a premium holiday the last few years, haven't had to pay a lot for that. The premium holiday we're projecting will end. We haven't been told that.
We have not received formal
And
confirmation.
last year, we didn't receive it until about a week before the budget was due. So in order to be conservative, we're assuming that the premium holiday will end, and then we'll be charged the full amount. But I guess it's a good thing that we've had it on a holiday, but all good things must come to an end, and we're just saying we're going to guess it's going to go up. I'd love to be wrong. So you can see when you plug just a very simple plugging in of these numbers. They're based on, for 2015, we try to be a little more educated in our projections based on things that we've heard. For example, utilities. We have talked to WPS. We know where our track record is. So we've plugged in these numbers. But you can see for 2015 that the overall increase is projected to be based on all these assumptions here. On the 2015 column, the number in bold, about 2/3 of the way down, 1,849,000. With these assumptions, our budget would increase by $1,849,000. So that gives you a rough idea of what we did on the expenditure side. We also made a modest assumption for increases in levy support, and we plugged that in as well. So even though you don't see the detail for garbage collection and disposal and street lighting and senior and transit and library, we've made an assumption that those levies would go up. We just plugged it in. We're not asking you to approve, it's just, you got to plug it in somewhere, so that's what we did. And that's where we come up with the overall change in the budget is $1,849,000. So when you take that, now you have, I'm sorry, there is another sheet. Yeah, thanks. We already did have that one out. Why don't you go through that one?
So this really is the final point of if you're going to statistically look at your revenue and your expenses, what is the impact of that analysis? And what it's showing is if if statistically our numbers hold, in 2015, we will have a deficit of the $1,119,327.92. So what we're doing here is taking our expenditures from our model for our cost projection, and then taking our revenues from our revenue projections and saying if these hold true, this is going to be the amount of deficit. And then you'll see these, in particular, 2015, rolling forward onto the next analysis of how do we cover this calculated deficit using statistical measurement.
Then when reality hits and we take a look at the real submissions from departments and we get the real revenue figures, then we bring it all together. But this kind of gives you an idea of where we think statistically we could be when we present the budget to you. Now, when we present the budget to you, we're going to present you a balanced budget. That $1,119,000 is going to be zero because we're required to do that. But it gives you an idea of what we're going to be facing statistically when the numbers come in. We've plugged in, for example, 2% for departments to assume with their budgets. As a result of that, we think payroll is going to go up about 2.37%. That's what we expect to see when departments submit everything. And revenues, a lot of these revenues from the state we're not going to get until late September anyway. But this is our best estimate. Love to be wrong, love the revenues to be higher, but given what we told you last time with the state, we're not expecting too much of that. And then it makes an assumption on the levy. So we've got one more sheet to show you that Trina prepared to give you a rough idea, because we did only plug in 1.19%. And I'll pass this around before I start talking.
So what these two models truly gave us is the building block to begin the levy conversation, and what do we want to look at for a percent increase. So overall, that would have been the target goal of preparing these two models. It gives us a good starting base point of where we need to begin our levy discussion.
And as you'll see towards the end of the agenda, we want to talk about, if you want to give me some advice or insight on policy direction, the levy's obviously going to be one of them. So if everybody has this now, the 1.19 is there as we showed on the model, and we put that in there so you could see that 1,119,000 is comparable to the one that Trina did in her prior analysis. So you see that. At 2%, and right now we're at the projected tax rate is based on, and this is Steve Cummings, your question, our assessed value after TID is $3,451,000,000. Based on that, our current tax rate is $9.28. We made an assumption on the assessed value TID out. We've made no change in that, or excuse me, we've got $3,451,000,000. Our tax rate would be $9.39 with a 1.19% increase. And then you can see we just plugged in arbitrarily 2%, 3%, 4% to give you an idea of what it would do to the projected shortfall as well as the rate and then overall revenues. So that kind of gives you a flavor of where we're at. 2% increase in the levy would generate $640,000 over the current year, 3% $960,000, 4% $1,281,000. So it gives you an idea what would happen to the tax rate as well as what the projected shortfall would be. The shortfall isn't eliminated even with as large as a 4% increase, but we're just showing you statistically what that is. Now, with that said, these are probably because we're dealing with an assessed value that we have a very high confidence level for, these are probably the most reliable numbers you're seeing, but they're all based on what you ultimately pick as a tax rate. And that's the most unpleasant job that you have. But it gives you an idea of what a 2% levy increase would look like. And what we'll still have to close the gap before we submit this to you.
For the city revenues, obviously a tax levy increase is one way. What other ways are there to possibly increase revenues?
Every department will have a discussion with me about that possibility. As part of the last year's exercise, when we did a 5% reduction, I gave all departments the option to propose revenues to offset. Unfortunately, for some departments, like fire, that has virtually no revenues, and what revenues they do have are really on the ambulance side, not anything else. On the fire suppression side, there are no revenues. Contrast that with Public Works, which proposed a recycling fee, which was a way to generate revenue. Public Works has more ability to raise revenues. Mr. Davis in Community Development, he has fees that he can charge and he can change. So each department's different. Police department, who's not here, you can't solve all your budget problems by writing tickets. Even though people, when they get a parking ticket or they're convinced that that's what we're doing, I assure you that that is not the way for us to balance our budget. Maybe if you're Rosendale, I don't know. But it just, that's, so there are discussions that we would have. We were not making any assumptions on any new fees, any new basis in fees. We're just statistically saying, here's what we've seen over the last couple of years, and we just plugged them in. We thought it would be a good way to get you to understand where we think we could be going, because right now all we can give you are statistics until all the departments finish their budget preparation process. These are the best numbers we have.
For example, there's a $25 fee for the city to generate a letter when a home sells. Is that comparable with other communities? Are we high? Are we low?
Those are the types of things that we discuss with each department, and so I'm looking at Mr. Davis. I mean, that's something that, in a discussion with Mr. Davis about his budget, that's something we would bring up.
But traditionally, the city in the last 3, 4, 5 years I've been on council, fees have been increased where we can increase them. So to me, I think we're at a point where I don't think I could support increasing any more fee increases. So the next option, obviously, and we've talked about this before, is probably cuts in services or cuts in employee, because that's really where you can only make savings.
And it goes back to 75% of our budget is personnel.
It's personnel.
So these are the we're not suggesting how we're going to do it. We're just saying this is sort of what when the tally comes in from the departments and the tally comes in from Trina and her staff getting all the revenues together, we anticipate somewhere in this ballpark this kind of situation we're going to be in. And then we'll take a look and evaluate. Are there revenues that we have overlooked? Are there things that we haven't done in the past? What cuts can we make? What efficiencies can we incur?
Not to interrupt you, but
No, go ahead.
based on these assumptions, then how does your staff then look at these assumptions as they put their budget together?
These are statistics. We won't have a great deal of discussions with this. We're going to get into the more substantive stuff. What have you looked at fees? Are we comparable to the market? What efficiencies can we gain? Are we doing it the same way? Is that the right way to do things? Having a position that provides X service, is that even relevant anymore? Do we shift resources around? Do we propose a cut in a service? We have those honest, tough discussions. The goal for me is to bring a balanced budget to you, and I will. Part of that process towards the end, which you're quickly getting to the end of the agenda is, what kind of direction do you want to give me in terms of levy? What kind of direction do you want to give me in terms of directions to departments? And then, based on that input, I have to make my best recommendation to you. But you also have part of us doing it now is, and one of the things we talked about is, boy, it's a lot easier to take a look at these tough decisions when you've braced us for what we're expecting in October, rather than plopping it in your doorstep on Friday night, 10 days before the budget hearing, and then you're like, oh my gosh, why didn't you tell me earlier? I think we got a rough idea. And if you said, for example, 1.19% on the levy is about all I can accept, then we know what we have to deal with, and we can move forward with that. What kind of directions do we want to give departments? Do we want to take a look? But Steve, as you mentioned, some of our bag of tricks is getting a little light, because we've dipped into that bag, and you can't keep going back to the fee trough every single time. If the market says it warrants an increase, we can take a look at that. But if the market's not warranting it, and with everything else we've done in recent years, how much, what was the word? You used a really good word. It dealt with taxes, but it really applies to fees as well as anything.
Tolerance.
Thank you. That was a perfect word. What the tolerance is for the community.
I think with fees too, it's like, back in the private sector with products. I mean, you should increase your price annually, a small amount. Don't wait for 5 years or 10 years and then do a price adjustment. Then you have sticker shock. I think this should be reviewed every year, and I think we've got to move up a little bit every year on a lot of these different fees. And what type of fees do we charge, say, developers that come in and chew up a lot of staff time? Are those fees correct, incorrect? Where should we be? That type of thing.
One thing that we had done, like 3 years ago, Long Range Finance Committee, when I was on it, was we established a protocol to go over the fees. I mean, part of it was the cost. There were a number of factors, and there's actually a sheet that was prepared. It's supposed to be prepared on a third of the fees each year. I don't know that it's been done. I raised this last year and asked this question again, but on a third of the fees, it involved several factors. One was, as I say, what the cost is, because the cost is supposed to be part of it. In some cases, there are statutory requirements for the fees or statutory limits on the fees, which are independent of things like that. What the competition is charging. I think those are the three main ones. In fact, on the review sheet, it says this is what the competition is charging, this is what the cost is, this is what the statutory requirements are. I don't know if there are any other factors or not. Those were the main factors that came into it. Mm-hmm. Because different fees have different sets of requirements.
But
also competitiveness is a piece of it. So actually, that's supposed to be done each year to a third of the fees.
We didn't do it
You can't do it to all the fees every year. It's just incomprehensible to have that kind of study.
So they have to be monitored.
So I don't know whether, and it was supposed to be monitored with Long Range Finance Committee. So
I think ultimately, though, the totality of fee increases isn't going to make up for these differences. I mean, it's a drop in the bucket, and I think we haven't had these models before, but all of these models, looking at them together, I think is about the best illustration that we've had of what the mayor always says each time that there's an increase to something to do with payroll or something to do with benefits, that it's an annuity, not just a cost for 1 year. We can see here how those raises whatever increases, unfold over. So we need that. We need obviously the offsetting growth of valuation in this community to help us with that revenue generation.
And part of that review process, it was pointed out that our level of fees, as you point out, you can't change much each year. It was as much a question of fairness and competitiveness as anything else in terms of that, so we didn't drive people away or something along those lines.
I think
but there's a limit, as he says, and that can have negligible impact actually on the bottom line of the budget when it comes to fees. Mm-hmm. If you look at our revenues, there aren't a lot of money come out of fees. If you increase it by 5%, you aren't going to do a lot of improvement into the budget.
It's really more of a fairness than a revenue generating.
It's fairness and making sure you stay even and making sure you don't discourage people from doing something or or anger them. So.
Because of the turnover last year, I think we had that problem. So that's something that we'll take back, is something we want to make sure we get back up to speed on those revenues, for no other reason, for fairness, not necessarily to magically balance the budget. So again, the model, you can see what Trina put together, and we did this several years ago, so I appreciate the feedback, but we had done this several years ago, but I think it was so well received by council a few years ago, we thought this would be good to resurrect this, and so, but Trina tweaked the assumptions a little better, tried to do a little more statistical analysis and trended out a little differently than we had done in the past, but I think you remember Charlie Carlson, when he was, I had shared this with him, that older forecast from several years ago, and when he was pitching to you why we needed to address wages, he showed this and said, look, this is what you've got to face. Well, the reality is, whenever you do a projection like this, when you make very conservative assumptions on revenues and very conservative assumptions on expenditures, generally you're going to have that parting of the ways. The goal is to bring it back every single year, but it does show you that with a conservative estimating of revenues and expenditures, you could potentially have a problem if you don't nip it in the bud. So part of what we're doing is preparing to nip it in the bud. Any questions on that? This is not intended to say recommendations or anything. A little farther down, I might push you a little bit, but it's not intended to be, I need your final answer. This is more, how do you want me to approach this? Any additional direction to either Trina and me or to departments as we get that. And, for example, Jeff goes to his library board Thursday and talks about what projections he wants to make in terms of levy, so he can take it through. He also has the library board, and also he has to take his other budgets to Winnifox. He's got the Winnifox budget he has to deal with as well. So,
when you're calculating the budget that you ultimately deliver to the council, the levy assumption that you put in that, or not even assumption at that point, the levy suggestion.
Recommendation at that point becomes a recommendation.
Is that broken down then for each of the departments that have their portion of the levy, like the library, like the museum that I note on here?
We do have that.
They're using the same I guess the same percentage that you're using.
What we generally do is we don't necessarily tell them that. We give them a specific direction on expenditures and push on each of the individual revenues. There are some revenues that are just totally inelastic. We can't do anything with them. Others have a little more elasticity, and maybe we can do something with them. We take it on a case-by-case basis. The levy, we really take a look at on a larger scale. We don't take a look necessarily at the individual departments, although I would say Alan and his department, because he is so fee-generated, when Alan's been very creative over the years on making a proposal to perhaps increase his budget with a fee that provides a new service. A lot of times Alan's proposed a fee for a brand new service that his customers and clients have said, I see value in you doing this for me, and I'm willing to pay for it. And we've added staff as a result of that.
In some ways, this year might be a technology reason that if we want to take credit cards, we might have to charge a 2% fee to take those credit cards. So that's something we're looking at as well at the counters now. 80% of our customers want to pay with credit cards, but we got to cover those costs.
On the other hand, and why you can't necessarily do it across all departments, police is not here. Their fee raising ability is virtually non-existent, with the exception of fines and forfeitures, which we don't. That's not what we do. And then even when you take a look at fire, their only real fee they get a little bit of insurance money from the state, and then ambulance fees. But ambulance fees are really so driven by what Medicare and Medicaid will reimburse that Tim could double his rates and actually see a decrease in revenues as a result, depending on where the market is. The feds really drive a lot of what the ambulance fees ultimately are, because they determine what you're going to get reimbursed for, regardless of what the fire department ultimately sets as their fee. So I can't necessarily treat Tim and the fire department and the police department the same way I can with Alan. Alan's is closer to a business model, so Alan can propose things and get immediate payback for them, and that's why we're able to have those very creative discussions with Alan. Whereas with Tim, it's like, well, let's attract a new fee. Tim's coming, whether they're calling. Tim's coming for his services, and it's not the same business model that it is for Alan. I hope that answers your question.
I think so. I was just noticing on that 5-year expense model report that below where it was broken out, levy for garbage collection and disposal, level for cemetery. I don't know if you broke that out separately or if those are separate, I guess, itemized levy items, but
this goes back to, we created these funds primarily to get around expenditure restraint. And one of the reasons we set up the garbage collection and disposal levy was to get around that. It's created, it's a tangled web we weave. I would say probably, one of the very few that truly exists for a viable purpose is probably the library, because the library does have some statutorial authority, whereas none of the other ones really do. We really created those. Library may have been the inspiration, but the library and maybe a couple of the ones for like the Leach and Pollock that are revenue generating, if it wasn't for expenditure restraint, I don't think these would even exist.
That being said, Mark, for those citizens that might be watching on TV or listening on the radio, what puts them in the levy versus other departments?
Usually it's a dedicated revenue source that they have that can be specifically identified, and those fees are really intended to be by policy for a specific use, like the transit utility, the transit fees and the fees or the revenues we collect from the federal government for transit aid in the state. Those are dedicated for that purpose. They can't be used for anything else. So we create those funds specifically. But at the end of the day, there's still levy support that you have to provide for transit. There's a 43% match that we have to provide for combined state and federal aid. So that reflects our 43% contribution.
Yeah.
Couple questions. When do we go back into labor negotiations again? When are those contracts up for transit, fire, and police?
They're up now, and personnel has already begun discussions. You guys had a sort of an initial meeting to go over ground rules. It was just to go through ground rules, and we'll be meeting with you relatively soon to go over strategy for each of the individual unions. There's a method to where we think and how we want to approach this. So, again, we're making assumptions in here that we hope are based in some hopeful outcome, but the reality is there's a lot of give and take that happens over the course of time.
But I mean, is that factored in? I mean, because when you really look at it, it seems like, we nearly kind of settled it, and then we had to retro back, which then put a crinkle in the budget. So, is there any way that we're going to be able, moving forward, to not have that happen again and place ourselves in the same situation?
The assumptions that we've made a basic assumption on wages and what that impact might be. So you'll see, for example, the 2.37% on payroll. We've made some assumptions on that.
But it gets real conservative after that first year.
Right. It gets very conservative after the first year.
Which is, so I think it's,
And-
you were super conservative on that side. Generally, the expense side, you generally go high for conservative and low on revenue. So when you say
At the same time-
when you say conservative on expenditures, you're really kind of being
With the
opposite, because generally for expenditures, conservative is you're going high. You're saying you think it's going to be high and you hope it's going to be lower. For revenues, when you go conservative, you assume low with the hope that it's going to be higher. And you were using the word conservative in the same way, both.
I
You see
stand.
what I say?
Yeah, I understand.
Because I think we were aggressive on the expenditure side assumptions.
Yeah, I'll stand corrected. The other dilemma that we have, because we deal in the public, is what number do you put in there, and then that sets the bar,
I understand.
and that's why the quicker we have that discussion in closed session, the better.
The other thing is too, and this just came up this afternoon, there was a business owner that had contacted me and apparently was sent an invoice for $5,000 for something that was missed actually back in 2012 to the tune of $5,000 payable in 30 days. Do we have a number of those out there in which we anticipate revenue in then for this year to help offset some of this? Or was this perhaps maybe just one thing that was caught, or were there a number of things that were caught?
I don't know the details of what you're talking about, so I don't necessarily know the
Public
answer.
Works. Apparently it was something, a connection to a lateral, it was something that the charge was missed back in 2012, so they received the bill a couple weeks ago for $5,000 payable in 30 days. So my question is, do we have a number of those out there, which is revenues we didn't anticipate?
Okay, we'll have to check on that.
Okay.
Not sure if it's an en masse thing or if it was just a one.
In some ways, you
one or-
hope it's one, but in some ways, I was like, well,
Yeah.
if we multiply that, it's one of those. Yeah, unfortunately, it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah. Was it a
Okay.
special assessment?
It's from a building that they built in 2012, and apparently missed a connection to a lateral, $5,000 payable.
Okay. Okay.
So that's where I didn't know if there was something maybe within accounting with Trina coming on that perhaps all of a sudden there was some things that were found, or if it was maybe some things that had come in late and there was a number of them.
I don't know if you want me to comment a little.
I don't know if I want you to either, but go ahead.
Well, we have what are called hook-on charges, and prior to my arrival, if you had property that was in the town and the city put utilities down a street, but you had property in the town, the city could not charge you for those utilities. So I think, are you talking about a property on 9th Ave? Yeah. Okay, so what the procedure was, we wouldn't, the code didn't require that when they annexed, when that property came into the city, that they make the payment. So there was no way of keeping track of who owned what until they actually built on the property. So that property fell under one of those situations where it had come into the city a long time ago, but it was not built on until just recently, as opposed to, I think it was like 98, 99, we changed the rule and said, if you annex to the city, you have to get charged those hook-on charges immediately, so that the clerk and the finance department don't have problems trying to keep track of when somebody takes out a building permit. Because we in Public Works or the clerk's office or the finance department is not necessarily going to know when somebody takes the building permit out to know that these other charges should be charged. So we've changed the procedure. In that case, that was one of those old, I can't tell you when that was annexed, if it was in the 70s or whenever it was, but it was a rule that it didn't have to pay when it annexed until there was development. And it sat and sat and sat for many years without development until just recently. And then it was one of those deals where our office creates the bills. We have to know that somebody is out there building, and then typically we send the information down to the clerk. She works with the city clerk works with the finance director, and that it's a regular established process now, where as soon as you annex, there's an automatic calculation done. There's a payment sent out. So in this case, these utilities might have been installed years and years and years ago. Those people never, the property owner at that time just never paid.
Well, and I appreciate the explanation, but for purposes of tonight, are there a lot of those, or are there a couple of those?
Well, I can't actually tell you how many old properties are sitting out there undeveloped?
No, I'm
They
just,
get built. I think the
I'm
answer to your
looking-
question is not a lot.
Okay.
Because I've actually dealt with one today that was a little bit of surprise. Somebody got annexed, and we were like, well, we're sorry, but that has to get done, and they're paying it. I meant to send Dave an email on that. That's going to get paid. So they're few and far between. They generally go to, from an accounting standpoint, they probably go to the special assessment fund
I would think so.
anyway. They don't
that was
go
my
to the
second
general
question.
fund.
So if there's revenue, all of a sudden that we figured out that is going to come in, or hopefully come in this year, where exactly does that revenue funnel into?
And those revenues are specifically, because what we charge for are for sanitary sewer construction and for water main construction. So I'm sure those revenues have to go back to those two utilities that funded them in the first place.
There's probably an IOU on the books for each of those, so they'll get satisfied. The other one's going to get paid off, Dave.
Right, okay.
Thank you.
Okay. That kind of gives you an idea of where we are. The next section, debt, even though it takes up a lot on the agenda, we just wanted to make sure we covered a lot of ground. It's not proportionately going to take up that much of the meeting. Yes, we're going to be out by 7. Trina and I have discussed the components of the debt and the CIP. So Trina's going to talk a little bit about some of her observations that she's been making about this.
What we've been working on as we have been developing the 2015 CIP is really evaluating all of the items that are currently put into our CIP. And is it something that we need to potentially look at and move to a different source of funding? For instance, do we have items such as repair and maintenance that really should be in an operation budget because they're repair and maintenance? But past practice, we've just moved them into the CIP. Do we have vehicles that last 10 years in our CIP? So what we've been looking at in the 2015 CIP process is, have we moved items inadvertently that we need to direct back because they would be more appropriate under an operation budget or under a capital outlay in a budget? We have found some items that might be more appropriate in an operation budget. And the reason and the primary purpose of this is if we're going to control our amount of debt, we want to ensure what we're issuing debt for is and meets the standards of borrowing. Does it have a life longer than 10 years? Is it a CIP or is it an operation and maintenance? And as we've evaluated this, we have found some items that we could potentially redirect, which has led us down to the path of, do we need to look at developing a policy of what items do we want in our CIP, and what items do we want to be redirected in other areas, with the hope of impacting our long-term debt and our borrowing capacity.
For example, we have pickup trucks that we have kept for 10 years. So from a borrowing standpoint, we're totally in compliance. But being in compliance and making that a prudent move are two different things. There are some people who lease vehicles. There are some people who borrow for the 7 years financing. And if they keep their car or truck for 15 years, maybe 7 years isn't such a bad idea. If they're keeping their car for 6 years and they still owe 1 year on the car, maybe not such a good move. Even issues of capital items with a life of 10 to 15 years, if we're paying on 10 years on this, is that something we even want to do? It's not that it's wrong or illegal, it's just fiscally, is it prudent to do? And so Trina's been breaking down the CIP to identify what's marginally legal for 10 years, what's clearly legal for 10 years, but still maybe not such a good idea. And even the 10 to 15 year, the pickup trucks, which we're hanging on to, do we really want to finance those over 10 years? Or is there some other way? Do you want to make a down payment or something like that? I mean, it's very common sense
And to
types of
that
things.
comment, if you move it from one category or take it out of CIP, put it on their operation side, where does the revenue come to cover that then?
Well, that goes back to things such as the levy increase and where we're going to prioritize our levy increase, the eventual creation of a sinking fund, the value of creating a sinking fund. It'll come back to your question, though, well, where are you going to get the money in the first place? But part of debt management is going to be, should you be paying for those things in cash, or should you be paying for those things with debt? If we're building a 50-year sanitary sewer beneath the ground, for 50 years, borrowing is probably not such a bad idea. But if we're, it's these marginal things that they meet the legal requirements, but we've been doing a lot of borrowing on that, and that is a habit that we've gotten ourselves into. This habit has existed. Don't get me wrong. This habit has existed here for easily since the end of the last century, 15 years. I mean, this is not something that's been relatively new. And a lot of it, I think, as Trina, you did a little more when you came in the other day and you talked to me, probably was done for expenditure restraint issues as well.
That's, is it a way of controlling the levy increase, the way of controlling tax increases is by, extending your payment out farther, as a lot of consumers do.
Under expenditure restraint, if we limit our increase, debt service is excluded from expenditure restraint. So if you borrow for it, it doesn't show up on the books. And there are plenty of communities that did that. We did this as well. And as you're borrowing more for it to keep under expenditure restraint, eventually you start borrowing for a lot of things that you maybe didn't want to, but you did because of expenditure restraint. Now it's coming back to bite us a little bit because we've borrowed for so much under expenditure restraint. So part of the first step to our discussion has been, do we want to start taking a look at those things and saying, maybe we shouldn't be borrowing for those in the first place? We don't
What
have to
is
keep
leasing? How does leasing affect the whole expenditure restraint issue?
It spreads it out. And we've had discussions with some departments about maybe leasing makes perfect sense, particularly for the enterprise funds. There are a lot of good examples. The council just did one a couple of years ago for the golf carts.
Golf carts.
That was totally prudent for them. As we've had that discussion, we've said, well, maybe we ought to take a look at some other things. Trina's been saying, well, maybe we can take a look at it. We don't want it to replace borrowing because then essentially it's the same thing. But are there prudent reasons where we get a great return on our investment by a lease to purchase with the golf carts? We're leasing and purchasing them for $1 at the end of their life, and we've got an asset that has residual value, and we ended up selling those carts with residual value and did the lease process again. That was a very prudent move.
It could be even as simple as renting fax machines, copy machines, things like that, versus purchasing them outright.
Yeah, and we've done that in the past, and that's also a prudent move. The question is, do you do it for some other things?
Right.
Somebody was even asking me today about, well, did you ever consider doing a lease purchase on the central garage? Even now, at this point, it's like, hey, I'm always open to talk about those creative things, but I want to make sure that we're doing it not to mask borrowing, but to because it's a good business move that
Fiscal responsibility.
gives us, it has a return on our investment.
And how does leasing affect, like, state contracts for vehicles?
From a purchasing standpoint,
We'd be better off going through the state contracts for, say, police cars versus leasing.
purchasing wise, I mean, we can do a lease bid as easily as we can a purchase bid. Would we be able to do it through the state bid? Not necessarily, but we could also, I've purchased vehicles from businesses that have a state contract, not through the state contract. So you could invite them to bid on something. If they know that they can order a vehicle, you can do it that
Or
way.
what about vice versa, where we purchase some other community's leased vehicle versus buying new? Have we ever looked at that? You know, maybe you don't get the full 10 or 15 years, you only get, say, 10, and you get a vehicle with only, say, 25, 30,000 miles on it, a truck or whatever it might be, that would carry us through that. And, you know, role reverse it, that instead of always buying new, maybe we buy some things, not everything obviously, but some things used, or it was someone else's leased equipment. You know, municipality always has vehicles for sale and things like that, and so you know people, other municipalities, especially maybe the smaller communities, are more into that because of their budget size to buy someone else's used equipment. But there might be some things that would be out there. I mean, could we buy a used fire truck from somebody? I don't know. You know, I mean, would it make sense? I mean,
Dave's done that
on a
a little
vehicle
bit.
that isn't used as much, maybe, or something. You know, I don't know.
Dave's done that a little bit with some of his vehicles. If he sees a vehicle that's just really serving a purpose, but not, it doesn't have the same performance demands that, say, a fire truck does. And it's not, doesn't have to be as custom made. Our fire trucks are.
Yeah, they're
are-
pretty
are
custom.
speci- And they're custom made, but also consistently, because we want our firefighters to turn and open a cabinet, and it's exactly the same cabinet look that the other one has. But Dave's stuff, if it's used for like a seasonal type of purpose, we've looked at that. But can we do more of that? Trina's been whispering to me about, hey, maybe we ought to take a look at some other lease types of options. And I think we're going to have to start being creative about those things. My only admonition is I just don't want to do it to mask borrowing. I
Right.
want to do it because it's a good.
I think there's
smart
practical
business.
applications for that, but, I mean, we just can't do that in all scenarios.
It's not. Yeah, it's not
I mean, it's
magic.
It's practical at some point. And I think the thing that I think we all have to kind of remember right now is, right now we're building the financial foundation for the city, not for our council or any council within even the next 5 years, but it's the councils ahead that are going to, at that point, hopefully, and I don't know how many years it's going to take, is to say, okay, we need a new ambulance, we need a new squad car, we need new part for the water treatment facility, we can pay cash. We're not in a position, so right now, we've got to kind of take it. We gotta step back a little bit and remember what we're doing right now is not for immediate purposes, but for down the road.
Long term.
I mean, that's really we're trying to form, I guess, healthy habits now, because to your point, Mark, yes, ideally 15, 20, 25 years ago, there would have been an equipment fund, there would have been a number of things, and we can't borrow to the capacity that we've been borrowing. So right now, I hate to say it, but what I see this year, next year, potentially the year after, is it reminds me of the three coconuts with a marble underneath it. It's just kind of shifting it around because we're trying to get it to the operational. How are we going to, I mean, it's one of those things where we're moving back and forth because there's nothing that's not important. So, my question is, outside of the CIP, is each department right now, do they have like an inventory of items to say like, okay, we have this vehicle, or there's this main part in the water treatment facility, or this or that, quite frankly has a 20-year life, but it's already on 30. So that when it comes about, it's not like a punch in the throat to all of a sudden see, we have to borrow, $250,000 for a part because it's outlived its life by 10 years and they don't even make the part anymore, or you can't maintain anymore. So do we have in each department, so when we're looking at like the CIP and looking forward, do we have any type of inventory like that so we can anticipate that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, oh, yeah. And the answer to your question is yes, we do that. Each department, I mean, you probably described this identical conversation that I've had with our two heaviest equipment departments, which is Public Works and Fire. We've had that discussion. I mean, we've discussed, Tim has two fire trucks that are up for replacement. One is younger than another one, but that one is absolutely in horrible condition. We've got to have that in the CIP, without question. How's that, Tim?
Right.
We really do need to, and we go through that, but we also take a look at not just what's on the docket right now, but if I defer this item B in favor of item A, what are items C, D, E, and F in 2016, 17, 18? Because the bumping effect could have a cumulative impact where you've got a glut of vehicles. For some reason, we purchased a lot of transit vehicles 10 years ago. Is it 10? There was a big grant and we purchased them, and now they're all due. And it was like, we're not going to replace all of them at one time. Thanks, Gary. Thanks for appreciating that. But you can't replace all of them in 1 year. It's like, how are we going to replace these responsibly over a period of time? Well, the first thing is, like, which ones are the worst? Are there any that really do need replacement immediately, or is it just because a magic 10-year, 10th birthday candles on this piece of equipment, it's time to replace it? That's not what we do. And
But like with that though, at some point I think it would be useful, not today, but going into next year for council to see those types of things. Because 3 years ago or 3.25 years ago when I toured Chief's department, I asked them, what do I need to know about today, or what do I need to know for the future that's not necessarily relevant today? And the thing that came up was the twins, and that was over 3 years ago. So am I surprised? Not at all. But it was nice to know it was coming, so it wasn't like that punch in the throat, because it's not like a $25,000 line item. I mean, it's significant. So, that's where I'm kind of saying, for our purposes, it's helpful to know, but also I think for future councils, I think it's helpful to know. Because we can anticipate that as we make decisions and vote throughout the year.
And those are the types of things that I'm going through with departments right now. And we've really done a lot of that already. The question is, how much do we explain to you so you say, thanks, I needed to know that, because I can't just simply say, well, we're only going to give you this much money, but we've just created a glut for you next year. That's doing a disservice to you as council members or to your successor councils. It's like, who made that decision? And it's like, was that Deb's decision in 14? No, Deb was saying, don't make that mistake. It was Herman's, yes.
We'll put the blame on her.
But who was that? Was it the council in 14? Well, no. The council in 14 asked these questions, so we don't have this glut coming up. And the quints coming up, I mean, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the quints. Dave's got snow plows that come up. And, those snow plows, you don't just say, well, sorry, we can't replace a snow plow truck. We got to have a reliable fleet of snowplow vehicles, and we got to replace some. We just can't putting it off. On the micro scale, the council deserves a lot of credit for what they did with the police department. In the last few years, you said, we need to do this, because back in 2004, we made a decision, and it was a collective decision. It was staff and council made a decision that we were not going to buy any police vehicles for the year. And the cumulative effect really bit us. We're now seeing the benefits of recognizing what happened, because the maintenance budget was just going through the roof. And we started to replace these vehicles on a more appropriate schedule, and we had to accelerate a couple of those because we fell so far behind. And when we did that, Scott's maintenance budget went from $80,000 to $45,000. So we saved the price of, and I pointed this out, we saved the price of a pickup truck for parks or public works with that one move. So there is value to knowing what's on the cutting room floor. And I think that, what do you know? I appreciate you showing me what you're showing me, but what are you not showing me? And I think that's what I'm hearing from you.
That's exactly what
don't hide the deep dark truths that you need to know about, because you're going to have to live with those decisions down the road.
That being said, too, though, and I think you've brought us up to speed numerous times, and Steve Brand has too. The DNR changes a lot of their water quality stuff and the waste treatment plants. And are we projecting down the road that we're going to need to make some significant changes in wastewater treatment and stormwater utility? Those types of things, so that, to Councilmember Allison Osby's comment, it's not just equipment, but our infrastructures. Are we able to put some dollars aside, or have some plan in place, so that if the state now mandates higher water qualities or less phosphorus or whatever it might be, or long-range sustainability type things, that we aren't caught off guard. I mean, and I know it's hard to put that in a budget, but at the same time, I don't think all of a sudden, we have to build a whole new plant or something like we did a few years back where we stuck major dollars. They're caught off guard, I think. I was on council, I think Mayor Tower was, but to that, I guess it's the same principle. I
You
guess.
know that one issue out there with phosphorus, and if they were to really slam us with new requirements, that'd be a $30 million hit.
Right.
Do we have that plugged into our 5-year CIP? No. We're fighting like crazy to make sure that we're never hit with that. But with respect to the facilities we do have, if we are aware that trends in water treatment or sewer treatment are going to change the technology, we're using a technology that was maybe in vogue 15 years ago, and now there's a new technology that's more environmentally compliant, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes we're grandfathered in, and we don't have to get the new rules until we redo
Make
the
a
plant.
change.
When we're doing those things, we are keeping an eye on those things, and I think Steve Brand is up on the environmental regs as anybody. And Steve has that discussions with Dave, and then when Dave and Steve come in and talk to Trina and me, that's the type of discussions we're having. I appreciate these questions because they really give you the answer is this is the type of stuff we're talking about. So without, as you said last time, I don't want to micromanage, but I just want to know that we're covering this stuff. So as we prepare for our last workshop, which we talked about doing CIPs, I'm going to try to figure out a way to give you that flavor, not to second guess us, but to understand that we're thinking long term. We're thinking 5 and even 10 years down the road when we're anticipating these. And Dave, I mean, you guys are the ones that have to get hit with that probably more than anybody because of the environmental changes that happen. And Steve Brand keeps up on that stuff very well. So he has a pretty good idea of, well, we got to do this, we got to do that. Some of the items on tomorrow night's agenda, the clear well.
Yeah.
We're anticipating the clear well is going to have to be replaced in a couple of years, so we're starting the design process now. And when we are aware of a change, environmental change, we make that change. And then in some cases, when the environmental change is in the case of safe routes to schools, we think it's stupid, we come back to you and say we don't want to take the grant because we think it's a stupid rule. It's not that we don't want to comply, but why would we comply for a $5,000 improvement? Let's comply when we're doing the whole street. Then it's easier and it's more cost-effective to comply.
I think it's just the main reason is if you look at the 40,000 mile high view, when you and it's a great question to ask. Where are we leaning? Are we looking at any increase in the levy? If we are looking at one, what are we looking at? And so we say to ourselves, okay, well, here's what we're dealt. This is the hand that we're dealt this year, but 4 years from now, 3 years from now, next year, we know we're going to have an enormous amount because the whole thing with the CIP is we're looking to try to get under that 70%. So we're trying to maintain this new magic number and hold that. Well, to your point, Trina, is, what is the tolerance? Okay, so if we know in a couple of years we're going to be hit with some pretty substantial issues that are coming down the pike, well, maybe this year either we can't raise the levy or it's nominal because we know we're going to have to ask the citizens to do more 3 years from now. And it's not perfect because we don't know what we don't know. That's the bottom line. A lot of the stuff that's in place, that may or should have been replaced 25, 30, and 50 years ago, we don't know when it's going to go, and we don't know if it's $1 million, we don't know if it's $2 million, we don't know if it's 12 or if it's 250. So I think that it's just kind of that overall view, and that's just a reality because while it's a 2015 budget, every year that I've been on here and looked at the budget, every year is more challenging than the previous year. And I just mentioned something, I think, both to you and Mayor Tower yesterday. Each year that I've come on, it was supposedly supposed to be the worst budget year we were ever going to have. Well, then the next year came, and that was the worst budget season. And this one's even tighter because we pulled all the low-hanging fruit, as ways to kind of supplement, some of the deficits. So it is what it is. So that's where I'm just kind of saying is we can't foresee the hand that we're going to be dealt, but if we have some type of insight it's not micromanaging, it's just thinking a little bit of strategy.
Put two or three things here and a little bit of focus and then to kind of move and see where it is you want to go from. One issue that we raised, and Deb pointed this out before, is there kind of a couple of issues here. One is a policy, what's in the best long-run interest. And I think really in terms of what ought to go into the capital budget, what should not go into the capital budget ought to be decided by the Long-Range Finance Committee. Again, that was one of the reasons for having that committee. So I think in terms of the long run, that ought to be done.
Is that something, I mean,
Yeah,
generally?
wow.
Yeah, I think.
Okay, I mean, it
Yes.
seemed obvious to us as this was going
That's been
on.
decided before. That was one of the generations originally of the Long Range Finance Committee, was this yearly stuff that we need some permanent policy. We need some policy. We also have to recognize there are going to be some short-run issues here, and they might come up or you might have departments think about short-run strategies. For instance, one of our long-run strategies, as Deb had said, is each year be given a more realistic 5-year CIP in terms of so we can anticipate what's coming down the road. The other thing, though, we have to keep in mind is that each year we may have to make some adjustments. In the past, we've been driven by the adjustments totally without the plan. We're still going to have it because, one of the issues is the last issue there, and this we'll have to decide each year, is the impact on expenditure constraint. We may decide that we have to do some things in a year for which we don't have the money to do it in the operating budget, so we may, in a given year, just recognize it's a violation of the policy to put it in expenditure constraint. I mean, that's how we got into the problem with some of these items, is expenditure constraint wrote us into a problem where we had to bond for things that we needed because we couldn't put them in the operating budget because we'd violate expenditure constraint. And a way around expenditure constraint is throwing items into that. But that's kind of a yearly thing, but we ought to recognize that is a yearly thing. The other thing is we could think about short-run and long-run strategies. Buy versus lease. There are certain things that leasing, and again, maybe long-run finance can look at some of these, or individual departments, some things that may make more long-run sense to lease something. If it's something that's going to be innovative every year, it may make more sense if it's going to change. If you get a computer and the computer's going to change every year, why not lease one? Why buy it and sell it? It makes more sense. Other times you lease in the short run because you don't have the cash to pay for it. I mean, just like people with cars. Some people lease because they like to change the cars every year and they don't want to buy and sell. And so it's a reasonable strategy for them. Other times people lease because they don't have any other way to have a way to get to work. And in the short run, leasing is cheaper. And in a given year, we may want to lease something even though we know it's a higher cost because we're trying to. So leasing can be a short-run or long-term strategy. So departments ought to look and see other long-run positive things for leasing. And in a given year, we may go short-run because we don't have the cash and we need them. That's what we ourselves do. So what do you need for us relative to this year's budget?
Really, it's section 5. I mean, we wanted to give you an idea of where we
that's-
were going with the debt. I appreciate the consensus with bringing to long-range finance this issue, because that really is a debt management issue at its core.
But the other thing that goes along with it, though, is again, they want to think about is thinking about longer-run sinking fund or something for capital expenditures, which you've talked about before, and suggesting maybe to the council that one thing in each year's budget. I know we did this in another organization, when we had the same problem. We said we're going to take 1% off the top. Right off the top and put it into a fund. It's going to take us maybe 5 years to get that fund up to where we need it, but we're going to make a commitment. That's going to be one of our long-run strategies, is to take 1% of the budget and put it into a fund. That's the only way you can get there. You can't create a fund to replace equipment for everything all in 1 year. You don't have that kind of cash, but you can say that it's going to be important to us, so it becomes a priority. So Long-Range Finance might suggest that each year you take 1% or 0.5%, put it into a fund. It would be like a sinking fund or something like that.
But that being said, too, Mayor, long range can't take 6 months to a year to figure this out. If we want to get it started already in 2015, we got to have it before this budget gets done. So this has to go to the top of their list, in my opinion, if that's the direction council wants to go. Otherwise, it'll carry into 2016 or 17 before we even get it started. Because
I don't want to rush.
well, I don't want to rush them either, but in the same sense, you're already kind of talking in that direction of pulling things out of the CIP that you think should be on the operations side. So a sense of direction's already going that way. Now, to Mayor's point, maybe the sinking fund thing would be taking time to reevaluate, but in the short term, could it be as simple as, staff identifies what they feel are CIP items and things that should be out of the CIP
That's what we're
in
going
a sense of direction, with the idea that they'll be working on but I think if we go into this budget without some concrete policy of some sort, then council's making a decision, and long range is going to say, well, why are we weighing in on this?
Okay, so to your point, I agree. Both of these, the two items that you mentioned, and I'll certainly talk to Councilor Peck since I had encouraged him to chair the long-range finance. But they would and they should. What it comes down to, though, is long-range finance is advisory and not necessarily a working committee. So typically what happens is whatever we put on our list, really the workload, a lot of it goes back to Trina. So I think it's probably really a legitimate discussion between long-range finance and making sure that, the group can meet and possibly could meet more than once over the next couple of months. And then, what we can contribute based on our general knowledge from our backgrounds is helpful, but I think some of the muscle will obviously come from her, and then I think that's a discussion between her and Mark as far as, okay, how does that fit in with everything else that needs to be done for the budget season? Does that make sense? I mean, is that fair?
Yeah, it makes sense, and I think it's,
I think Mark and Trina really have to work through this for this year, given where we are in the budget, but.
Right.
we've talked about some interim moves, and I think that was
That's kind of where I'm coming from.
But I mean, I think this is important for long-range finance to do. And like I said, it's certainly with the backgrounds of everybody on that committee is definitely going to be able to contribute to this. But again, really, a lot of the muscle is going to be her.
Okay. The next section is really just general discussion, which we've been having, but in the past, what I've simply done is said, this is the direction I'm giving to departments, and I can certainly give them direction, what we've done, and you can see what the numbers are with our projections, and we'll be getting into that. But at 1.19% increase, we got a $1.1 million potential shortfall, and we'll present a balanced budget to you, and I'll have to go through a variety of methods to do that. I did the 5% exercise. I can tell you that there's limited things that certain departments can do. You might see some of the same things. There are certain things based on last year's discussions that department responsibly has to make that same recommendation, and I'm not bringing to you because you've given me some clear direction that's not what you want to see. So there are certain things you won't see, even though the departments have done their job. So it's, are there any reductions that are off limits? Specifically, public safety was mentioned last year. Are there things that you don't want to see, or at least don't want to see at the top of the list? My feeling would be with the, for example, with the equipment, heavy rescue equipment unit, that is not going to be on a primary list of a recommendation I'm going to make to you. The councils, I think, gave me clear direction last year that they did not want that to be risk being eliminated. So while the chief may have to responsibly say in an exercise, look, that's about all I can offer up, I'm not going to put that in there. But at the same time, I'm not going to say that's unacceptable. It's just that it may not be acceptable to council, but it's an appropriate proposal for a department head to make. So, and then, and maybe the easiest one is, what number do you want me to plug in for levy increase, at least for purposes of discussions? It's clearly a policy issue. I'm not asking you to hold to it, but as I go forward, you got an idea what the different percentages may yield. And I say may yield. These numbers are based on a projection. We think we've done a pretty good job at analyzing it, but It depends on what those rascally department heads do with
Well,
us.
and I guess I'll go back, and I think I brought it up at last year's budget. I don't like the 5% across the board. There's some departments that maybe should be 10% or 3% or 2%. When you put everybody's apples in the same basket, I don't think that's fair to the departments.
I would agree.
I just think that there are some departments within the city that can't afford a 5% reduction and shouldn't have to go through that kind of exercise. There are others that, yeah, you bet, you got too much fat, maybe. But I just think when you put everybody together and it's 5% across the board, you end up with what happened the last couple of years, where we didn't agree with because you forced them to that point. I don't like a percentage. I just think across the board, I know when we do it with the levy, everybody takes that chunk if we increase it, or the tax rate or whatever, but I just think that's not a fair way to analyze every department by a flat 5%.
Let me go at it a little bit differently, because I think in some ways that's kind of up to Mark whether he does it 5% or not, and I'm not interested in micromanaging just how he gets at the budget, because he's responsible for the budget. I think we ought to go in the reverse order here, because the levy increase limit is a policy decision. How
Right.
much are we going to raise taxes?
Sure.
That's really a council decision. That's not his decision. That is going to drive maybe two of the two decisions above. In other words, I think we ought to have some thought. That's something we never really discussed last year.
Right.
But how much? And that's how most councils in the past have started. We'll accept 2% or 0% or 2.5% or 3%, and we never really did that. To me, that's critical, because that's going to set you up. And then also other things that are off limits. Then how he gets there, whether he does it
Yeah.
5% across the
Right.
board by department, I don't know which departments.
Yeah, me either.
I would tend to agree, but it's up to him to get the budget. But we got to set the parameter. I think we need. So I think the most important question here is, what do we think is about a levy limit? Because that's going to indicate to him what he's got to do. Because if it's 0% increase, that puts a whole new set of pressures on him, versus if we're willing to go with a 4%. If we had said up front we were willing to go with 4.6 last year, which we got to, which if we decided earlier we probably wouldn't have gotten to, we kind of got there at the end. So I think we ought to talk about the levy increase limit, about what's the number that we're willing to tolerate on the top end in terms of the taxpayers. And then work back. Are there any things that are off limits? That's an important question. Let him figure out how he's going to get to that number using the number. Because if we're not willing to give any tax increase, and I've seen this before in the budget, if we're not willing to do any tax increase, he's going to have to structure his budget very differently.
Statistically, I have 1.119 million to address versus,
Right. So that's going to dictate to you how limiting the off-limits discussions are, and how you're going to approach whether it's a 1% reduction across all departments or flexible, I don't know. But I think the biggest issue is the levy increase limit. What are we willing to top of?
Is that something that you guys need to know tonight? Is that something we can get back to you on within 24, 48 hours?
Oh, God, yeah, gosh, I think it's not required tonight, but that's just sort of framing it that way gives us an idea of where we go. And the other thing, and I appreciate all the comments the mayor made, one of the things that we've done in the past, and I say we, and I think we as staff typically does this. It's sort of, you can't look under the hood and see what's there until it's there, and it'll be ready when it's ready. With this type of dialogue we've been having, this is about as solid a number as we can have a discussion about, because we got a really good idea what the assessed value is. We know what a 2%, 3%, 4% increase in the levy is. The other stuff is really uncertain. I won't wait until I unveil the budget and ooh and ah. I'll keep you posted. Hey, here's where I'm going. This is where the numbers are. It wasn't 1.19 million, it was 1.2, or it was 1 million or 900,000. Wouldn't you love to hear that? You want to know that more in advance so you're prepared. This number going in, you got a rough idea of what it's going to mean. You aren't going to have a rough idea of what it's going to mean on the tax rate. If you say 2%, we're telling you it's going to be 9.47, plus or minus a penny. We're not talking major, oh gosh, we did something wrong. These numbers, those numbers you can take very reliably. It's all the other numbers that we don't know yet as those numbers change. What's going to happen with health insurance? I said 12. I hope it's less. If it's greater than that, wouldn't you rather know sooner rather than later? If it's less, hey, it's going to help out a little bit. If we can save $50,000 on health insurance, well, that cuts in. That's cuts into a lot of things. That's a person. That's this. There's that. So to me, I think I have an obligation to keep you in an ongoing loop on this stuff, not just say, sorry, it's not ready to reveal yet, and you can't look under the cloak and see what the piece of art looks like. This is a living document. We're getting together on September 17th. On the expenditure side, we'll pretty much be done. On the revenue side, we'll still be waiting, even on September 17th. As much as if we have all the department meetings done, I don't know if we can do September 17th, by the way. Even if we get all the departments done on the expenditure side, we're still waiting for the revenues on all the other state revenues. We probably won't get those until third or fourth week in September. That's just the way the state works. So I think working backwards, because that is the policy. The levy is a policy choice for council. Again,
I think we
don't
ought to
need
give
answer
them
now.
some idea, maybe, and send it in. It doesn't mean at the end we can't change it at the end, because we may say, we can't live with that at the end. But we're better off doing that than us giving him something and he comes and says, well, I think, it ought to be 3%. And all of us are saying, from a taxpayer standpoint, and that's why they elect us, that's the biggest thing they look at. We're not going to tolerate anything above zero. Then we've sort of put the screws to him late in the game.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we need to somehow or another, whether we do it individually, get it to him, he comes up with some sort of an average. It can still be changed at the end. I mean, we kept changing it last year. We were changing it after the first of the year. We changed the tax levy.
Would you be looking for a no greater than?
Yeah, because what that would do then is, whatever number that is the number that I'm going to plug in, and that one you will see in the final budget. Everything else may change, but if you give me a policy direction that you'd like to see, now you'll see that with that number, here's what I did to the budget, here's what I did with these expenditures, those revenues, that position, this stuff, and then you can look at it, and as the mayor said last year, in the final analysis, she said, you know what, Mark, we're willing to bend a little more on the tax rate, and you did. And that was your policy call, and that was within your realm. But if you give me a number, I'm going to hold to that number and balance the budget with that number, and then you take it from there.
Yeah, and you have under B, any reductions off limits, I always think about, and I'll be honest, I'm prejudicial to the public service side. I think core services, I think the average citizen, when they move to a community, they obviously look at core services of what kind of crime is in the community, what kind of fire services do we have, what kind of ambulance services do we have, what do our streets look like, what other things do we treasure, museums and libraries and all those. To me, those are core services, and those are things that citizens, I believe, expect from a community. So if you said what's off limits, I would say anything that's connected to what is deemed a core service. Now, every employee, all 650 of them I think we have, would say their services is a core service to the function of the city. I totally agree. But that being said, there are still things that I believe as a council member, citizens expect to come out of the city of Oshkosh. And that's good police, good fire, good streets, good public works, opportunities to go to the library, opportunities to go to museums, and those types of things. Are there other things that could be cut back? We've already cut back, cutting the grass in the parks. We've cut back on certain other things that we've looked at. And yes, it's the low-hanging fruit, and there might be some tough cuts when the time comes, but I think starting at the core services, I think are the most important.
But I agree with you up to a certain extent. But there's the core service and there's the dollars. The dollars don't equate one-to-one for core
No, they
services.
don't. They don't.
Because you can have a good service, at a certain price. To get it to the highest level phenomenal, the price is exorbitant up there. Never looked at safety, for instance. We like people to be safe. But you can get people up to 98% at one rate, and that last 2% to 100% is the most expensive
Sure.
2% out there. So
Right.
there's some judgment that goes into
Right.
that. So the core service at a good level, I think, is important.
Right.
But you don't equate it to dollars, you don't say, because it may be that you can have the service at a lower, so it,
Mhm.
and that's something he can use a judgment.
Well, I don't think anything should be off limits. If a department comes forward and says, this is what we can cut, then I think we should be able to look at that. I don't think there should be anything off limits.
I'm with you from that standpoint. Core services is important to make sure those services are there,
But
but how
that's a
much we
case by
spend to get
case
them
thing.
there.
To be able to look at everything that comes from a department I would appreciate. I think at this point, we need to be looking at everything.
I think when we go through this, we have to ask the question, what effect will it have on economic development? As you were saying, what do people look for when they come to a community? And if you don't have a lot of the things that are quality of life that have an impact on economic development, then we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot, because that's one of our strategic plan is economic development.
To that point, one of the things that we've put into the budget document that we probably don't give enough discussion to when we're doing it is, where in the strategic plan are we fulfilling goals within certain departments, so that you can see strategically, economic development is a goal, strong neighbors is a goal, good infrastructure is a goal, quality of life's a goal, and how we're meeting those issues. So that's an even tougher one. What I would suggest, Mr. Mayor, is that for the meeting on the 26th, not tomorrow's council meeting, but the council meeting following, put it on the agenda under discussion, direction to city manager, have a discussion at that point, give us some thought. There's a lot of stuff here at the door. Even when we give it to you a few days in advance, sometimes it doesn't all click until we're in here talking about it, we're running you through it. Some of these percentages probably look like gobbledygook. Hopefully, we've done justice to that. Give it some thought. If you have any questions, certainly give Trina or me a call, and maybe on the 26th, we'll put it on the agenda for general discussion. That's not too late. I mean, we're going to be just starting department head meetings on around that date anyway.
So the specific item is kind of the tax rate that we're working
Yeah,
out.
yeah.
That's
Direction to
this
city
is
manager
specific.
on projected tax levy, something like that. Would that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I appreciate the discussion, even though there's a little bit of differing opinions. I appreciate the discussion. That helps. And again, that one ends up being my job, but I thought I'd put it out there just it's a good discussion to have. I appreciate everybody's comment. But the levy increase, that gets the ball rolling for me on how I do it when I know what target I'm shooting at.
And we may have different ideas and have to compromise, I say 2.5 to 3 or 1.5 to 2 or something like that might be we might have to give you a range.
Right, these are arbitrary.
We're all not going to come up with 2.67. Or can we agree on 2 point? But we may be able, but we're going to know whether it's 0 or
I think
4
a
or
range.
6.
Yeah,
or-
I think a range.
So we
I'll
ought
bring
to
my
be- we ought to
magic
be able
eight
to give
ball
you some guidance that should help you.
But I agree. I think a range is good. I mean,
We're going to have to be prepared to narrow it, 1 to 6 is probably not a good.
that's
No,
That's what we have here.
3.5 to
Never works for us, but if you come in with
4.75.
we'll look at we'll decimals this one.
Yeah, we'll
Decimal.
decimal it.
And it can be changed, in the end, I mean, we have the ability, the decisions are not made until, as I said before, it'll be sometime in November, we'll make the final decisions based on more information than we have now.
In terms of the next meeting, and I only read this 3 times, so I apologize that Trina put September 17th on, and I didn't tell her to change it. I have a conflict on September 17th, which is a Wednesday. We've been doing it on a Wednesday, and tonight was just because of the election and everything. Would September 18th or the following week, the 24th or 25th, work?
I'm gone the 18th. I can do the 24th.
I could do the 24th.
Anybody cannot do the 24th, put it that way. Do we have constraints on the 24th?
I don't, so is it the 25th, is that the
24th,
Good for
Is
the
what?
24th.
Working Homes event?
my September,
I think the 24th will be fine, yeah, I think that's the 25th.
I'll have to.
24th
might be
is
the
a
25th.
Wednesday.
I think the 24th is okay. Is Wednesday generally? 24th is a Wednesday.
We're looking at the 5 to 7 again.
5 to 7 on the 24th, going
That's
once.
good for me.
I'm good on the 24th.
Check my calendar, I don't have it with me.
5 to 7 on the 24th, gentlemen.
That's
You might
what
wanna look
we'll-
and see what tomorrow night, if you'll be there, you guys can decide that. You're right, I think, on the 25th, Sean, I should have
Oh, Chris.
had that.
And what we'll do, for the meeting on the 26th, we'll give you a rough idea of what we're looking at agenda-wise. It's really going to be probably geared more towards CIP specifically, and one, I think the mayor made the point, and a couple other council members confirmed it. If we're shooting for a 70% target, we kind of know the number for the next 5 years, so we don't just push things back. We're going to be programming a little more, subject to change, as we said with Mount Vernon. Everything's subject to change in the CIP, but get a pretty good idea of what 11.4 million is going to get us to get there.
One last question. Are there buildings that are going to have to be addressed in the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, such as City Hall? I mean, this is converted from a high school. I mean, there are days when it's a little warm in there. I mean, are there, you know where I'm going with this, are there?
Oh, yeah.
Should we be looking at buildings that have to have maintenance, renovation, replacement over the next, say, quarter century?
Why don't you shake your head yes, Jeff?
yes.
I mean, Jeff, the 20th anniversary of the library. 20th anniversary of the library renovation is this year. 20 years, you start showing those signs of age. We've been working.
Systems wear out, our cracks in our facade.
Even from the
There-
addition?
And that's Jeff. Then you have
Museum.
Brad, we have got to replace a portion of a roof on the Steiger Wing. Gotta. I guarantee you will see that in the CIP. And those are the types of things when I was talking to Jeff the other day about, what we're doing with debt management, and what we've been doing is gotta do's, things that we just have to do. Some are contractual, but some are just, the Steiger Wing's leaking. We gotta do it. There's things that we phased for Jeff for the library, and we did the ones that absolutely needed to get done, but there's other ones that are knocking on the door. The building systems, they've done a really good job maintaining their HVAC system, but it's not going to last forever. The City Hall boiler, that's one that's, there's something else that, Brad's roof and boiler here at City Hall.
Well, Brad needs also storage space for collections, and so do we?
He was making the pitch to Trini yesterday, so I don't know.
I've heard about that.
Well, not even, I mean, that being
do we
said,
have a written down laundry list of all those things, priorities, and kind of a?
But can any of those?
Every one of you do, huh?
Okay.
For
Well-
those, that are the money that's at the foundation, I mean, can any of the money, be used from there versus in our CIP or operational? And mostly CIP.
If we can identify potential uses, we do. But, getting a flavor, and, as with this discussion with the issue you were bringing up earlier, and you're bringing it up again, I'm trying to piece together what the meeting on the 24th is going to look like, and it might just give you an idea of what the flavor is without getting a kneeling pad out here for them to beg, getting a feel for what some of the capital needs are out there. And a lot of it is, we got to get this done. This is on the horizon. Maybe we don't have to do it this year, but in the horizon, we've got to fix this. We got to fix this. We got to replace this. The quints won't last forever. One absolutely, positively has to get replaced. It's literally on fumes right now. The other one, just because it's not as bad as the other one, doesn't mean it doesn't need to be replaced. It just isn't as bad off as the other one. And Dave's, plow trucks. And Mr. Mauer isn't here. Ray would say, don't forget the guy across the street from the new building. And you took a tour and saw some of the things with parks and the shelters. South Park Shelter, long overdue. We put it off because we were trying to make sure it was right. South Park's got to get done, the shelter. And I say gotta, why? Because it's in deplorable condition, it's an embarrassment, and we should replace it.
You already mentioned it earlier. We probably need to get a plan in place for recycling our buses. How do we go through
Right.
that process? Is it 1 a year, 2 a year, 3 a year?
Yeah, I think we 1, 2, 3, 1. We figured out, it's like, this is how we're going to do it. But we're also subject to so many other things going on. But you're giving me an idea of what I think we want to set as an agenda, give a flavor. So the department heads, when we talk about this on Thursday, those are the types of things we want to kick around. How we, how do we get the Riverwalk completed? Somebody said, when are you going to get the Riverwalk done? And, we're going to do a project a year. That's my goal. Now, is a project going to be this big or this big or this big?
How much grant money we'll be able to obtain.
Yeah. If the grant money were to dry up, that would slow things down. But
In any of our plans or long-range plans, is there any thought of, like Steve mentioned, City Hall's been here, it's an old school, of purchasing property that we're just going to maintain it for 10 years, run it out, but eventually we're going to move into it, do something. Buy it now when it's cheaper, let's just say maybe, than it would be 10 years from now. Has there been any of that kind of visioning, thinking, or long-range thinking, kind of like, this will save us money down the line even though we're buying it now, or whatever it might be?
long range, but being very practical. The Armory, for example, represents an opportunity with relatively minimal investment to get some storage for Brad. Brad is, bursting at the seams. He's got to get rid of that old firehouse building. That's a piece of junk. So he's probably going to be the biggest beneficiary of that. But other departments, traffic, other departments are going to do that.
Or are there buildings that we currently own that we can sell, that we're not using? What's going to happen with, the boatworks, I guess, that building where the sanitation is now is going to get torn down, right? Or,
mercifully, it'll get torn down.
But is there other, like when the school district, we bought their building, they went and bought the old Coke plant. Are we looking at any potential places throughout the city, if they would become available, would be ideal for this or be ideal for that?
We have discussions during the CIP about those types of things. The reality is with limited borrowing capacity, we don't get overly optimistic about those things. But do we listen? This building, if we maintain it, is satisfactory for our needs. It's a little, we've worked around the fact that it was an old high school, but we've managed. But do we need to get a new HVAC boiler in here? Yeah, we do. And we got to make sure we stay ahead of that stuff before we start saying, well, boy, this building really needs to get.
I guess I'm using the
tired.
county, for example, they ended up buying the Bagash building. They didn't need all the space, but slowly they're filling it.
Yeah.
As they also move out of the safety building, so they're they're going to be moving courtrooms, and doing some things, and so I just think that they look, oh yeah, they only moved 2 departments in there initially, but within 5 years they'll be full.
Without the departments, bringing out the violins and making you feel sorry for them or anything, we have had these types of discussions. I'd say everybody. Wouldn't you say we've had these types of discussions about general needs and not begging, just more having a good logical discussion where facility needs are. Jeff and I really had a really good discussion this year about the fact that with 20 years, what systems are doing well versus not doing well for the age of the system.
That being said, with like Jeff's building, do other communities have? We own the building, right? The library itself is ours, so we cannot expect any revenue or money from other users at Winnie Fox to pay for that building, or things in that building.
I think
Or
Jeff
tenant.
can tell you how his relationship with Winnifox works. It's complicated, but it's, Jeff
They
understands.
rent.
And that helps, and that's, when you talked
They
about,
rent to locate in our building.
Okay.
When you talk about like a building like this, I mean, if we were to say, we need a new city hall, what do you do with a building this size? Do you just level it? That,
and what do you do, I mean, that's the same discussion we had with Public Works.
A lot of dynamite.
I still, you
built
know,
like a Sherman tank.
I still absolutely believe that, that locating the central garage where it is was still the right thing to do.
Oh,
So the north side of town will get developed one day and it'll be great, but we made a commitment to the central city. It looks like it's going to blend in well. You can already see that that's going to blend in well. We need to make commitments, and if we were to give up on a building like this, what are we leaving the neighborhood with? And are we leaving a glut of vacant parcels? We got plenty of vacant parcels. The market for vacant parcels is way too high. If we're going to make a commitment, we need to make a commitment to reinvest and continue there. That's my opinion. And
Well, I think most cities keep their city hall in a central location.
I think
They don't.
more,
Yes.
more some
Don't
of
go
the
out in
concerns.
town of Algoma.
And we made that pitch with the county when you talk, I mean, we made a strong pitch. The county considered moving their admin offices to the north side. And I would give a lot of credit to the chamber. We met with Mark Harris and said, why don't you take a look at some other places? Hey, what about the Bagash building? And from that discussion, the county bought it.
well, I mean, you know, it's a possibility technically that there's enough land use here, but we've outgrown the building, so we temporarily move and tear it down and build a new building on the same site, let's just say, or add on. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure Dave could say he could use more room in his department. I'm sure Alan needs more room. He's got more staff now than he used to have.
Well, let's
No.
take a look at technology.
Right.
Oh my God, we've got them in a closet.
Yeah, I
think
mean,
those guys like each other because they are literally right on top of one another. I mean, you know, I mean, if you go back and you think about it, I mean, if we do any renovations or we do anything anywhere, I mean, is it conceivable to say, you know what, we need something that might not be at City Hall, but, you know, maybe there should have been a, you know, something at the city garage that's just technology or someplace that makes more sense.
We have
Because
a-
it's, I mean, I don't even know how they operate, but I mean, anytime you go in there, I mean, Brad's busting at the seam.
Well,
They're busting.
and I know
The
it's
point
tough.
is, you can put people in different buildings in the central, so there's a lot of big vacant, important old buildings sitting
Oh,
around
yeah.
town. You just move departments.
Folks, I think we better bring this to an end. Visioning's good, the discussion's good, but we're kind of getting way out there now, so
Hope this met your
folks will meet
expectations.
tomorrow night. Hopefully, we've got the information they need, and we'll continue to get information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Roxy
Thank you,
Cliff.
Council.